Welcome to Transform Now, a podcast focused on intelligent automation and brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. On this program, we talk about how organizations globally are rethinking the way they operate, utilizing process orchestration and AI-enabled digital workers to free up humans to do the work that matters most. We also share insights and tips on how you can embrace this new way of working and unleash your full potential. Let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. I'm thrilled to welcome back John Rossman to the podcast. John is a former Amazon executive. He's a career consultant and advisor. He's also written a lot of books, and his latest book was released back in February of this year, 2024, and it's titled Big Bet Leadership. It's a terrific book. I've read it. And this will be the subject of our chat today. John, great to see you. Why don't you remind people about yourself? You've been on the podcast twice before, but I'm sure there's someone that missed those. So why don't you give a quick intro?
Good. Well, Brad, thank you for having me on Transform Now. You and I have had a great relationship and friendship, and I value that and appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, I'm John Rossman. I was an early executive at Amazon. I had key responsibilities in launching the marketplace business in 2002. I left Amazon in late 2005. I was then a partner at Alvarez & Marsal, where you and I worked together for 12 years. And it was really through that journey that I started to see the power of the many things that I learned at Amazon and delicately applying them into the situations that I had at hand. The Gates Foundation was my biggest client, and the client there said, like, hey, you should write a book about Amazon. So I wrote The Amazon Way in 2014. And it was at the Gates Foundation that I first heard this framing of what a big bet was. And so that was an interesting framing for what all these transformations, growth initiatives, automation initiatives, Gen AI really is, which is a big bet. And I've had the opportunity to learn from some big bet legends and have a client assignment at T-Mobile, which really helped me take a lot of the Amazon playbook and refactor it for a situation that was not Amazon and a culture that was not Amazon. And that kind of gave me the inspiration to have the perspiration to write Big Bet Leadership.
Excellent. Well, the last time you were on the podcast, we talked about the idea of pressure testing strategic initiatives, which don't always get inspected frequently enough or well enough, obviously, to ensure that they're not train wrecks waiting to happen. Since then, you've released this book, co-written with Kevin McCaffrey. I mentioned the title Big Bet Leadership, that provides a more comprehensive approach to ensuring that big bet initiatives are successful. And we know that historically, most of them do not succeed. I find this topic especially important in today's times as every company is making big bets that they view as critical to their survival. So, John, first off, why don't you tell us about your co-author? I don't know Kevin. I'd love to
Yeah.
hear about him. And then what inspired the two of you to write this book?
Yeah. So Kevin McCaffrey was my client at T-Mobile. So he was a senior member of the T-Mobile strategy team. Among other things, he led new business incubation. So think of it as growth and value propositions and products beyond the core mobile service for T-Mobile. I got to be the senior innovation advisor there for 3 years, and we built the tooling, the infrastructure, the process, and the mentality to help this company grow kind of beyond the core. He went on to be a senior member of the Google Ads strategy team. And it was in fall of 2022 that I wrote the framing for this book, and I sent it to Kevin. And he was an extremely busy guy, and he would never respond, but he immediately called me back, which I was like, oh, either he's not happy about this or he likes it. So he called me. He goes, John, I've been waiting for you to do something like this. And so give me an inch, I'm going to take a mile from somebody like that. And I said, well, think about being my co-author. I think it'd be a really powerful way for you to contribute to something like this. And so He decided to do that. He left Google in early 2023 and just focused with me on the book. Now we work together at Rossman Partners. But Kevin is the combination of intelligence is, I think, overweighted, but he's extremely intelligent and practical. And he has a superpower that I try to mimic, which is he gets at the heart of an issue and he simplifies it and he clarifies it. So he's a
Mm.
very good both thinker and then tester of an idea. And so I'm just very fortunate, and he was fantastic to collaborate with. It is the first book that I co-written with somebody. So that was a both the potential for dynamic, but the potential for bringing together more than what I could just bring to the book. And that's who Kevin is. And he's a very gifted thinker and practical facilitator for tackling hard problems.
Mm. Yeah, when you hear his background and you combine that with your background, you guys are the right tandem to write about big bets. A lot of big bets in your past that you've seen, some of which worked, some of which didn't work.
And we wrote this book for companies so that they would be both inspired, which is pretty easy, but actually, like, what do you tactically do differently? But we also
Mhm,
wrote it for the leaders who are either the executive accountable party for a big bet or the team that is serving the big bet and the leader. Because,
mhm.
and this is Kevin's insight, like, there's nothing better for your career than being associated with a successful, big bet. But it's also a very precarious situation because of the failure rate on these. And so
Mhm,
the what the book helps a team do and these leaders do is to safely have both high ambition, but recognize them for what they are, which is a set of assumptions and hypotheses. And how do we experiment and test these things out before we make big commitments? And so it allows the organization and the people involved to have this combination of high ambition while safely testing them out. This, to me, is what true enterprise agility is about.
John, as you've talked to people who have read the book this year, what are some of the responses you've received that have really surprised you?
Really, it's just how practical and tactical the recommendations from the book are. And so, one of the things I haven't done in my other books is I've been careful about prescribing too many things. It's been more of like, hey, this is how Amazon does it. What do you think? This book, we
Mhm,
got very much into much more of the diagnose the problem. Here's a principle or philosophy for tackling it. And then here's some tactics to put that principle in motion. We definitely took that framework relative to the book. We tried to keep the book, it's 45,000 words. So it's a pretty snappy read. So it doesn't suffer from TLDR, too long didn't read. But at bigbetleadership.com, you get a number of resources, a big bet journal, a pre-flight checklist, a big bet GPT,
mhm,
and a set of prompts that can help you
mhm.
take the book and put it into action. So we kind of offloaded some of the tactical aspects that could naturally be in the book into tools that you then use from the book that are all available for free.
The last time you were on, you explained what a big bet is all about, but I'd like you to do that again because I
Yeah.
think it's really important that we understand the essence, and people hearing this for the first time might be thinking of something that's a little bit left of center, if you will. So could you kind of dive into that?
Yeah. So a big bet as compared to an incremental or well understood kind of project or initiative. Like that's essentially kind of the 2 points to understand. A big bet has these two attributes. It has high potential, right? It has the potential for having terrific customer impact, company impact, but it also has complexities, risks, unknown unknowns, dependencies upon others that make it a very difficult situation to have high control of versus an incremental project and initiative, which are important. But if that's all you have, I think that's a precarious position to be in. But an incremental project is something that we understand it well. And as long as we kind of do our professional job of kind of managing an initiative, we should be in the realm of success relative to this situation. And so that's the fundamental difference between a normal project. Now, if you put a number of incremental projects together, so some smaller innovation ideas with big ambition on their own, each one is not a big bet, but together the portfolio encompasses a big bet portfolio, which is
Right.
can also be a big bet. And that really was kind of the essence of the business that Kevin ran at T-Mobile and the new business incubation was a portfolio of small ideas with high potential.
Got it. And John, did you and Kevin find that most companies are making the right big bets, choosing the right ones to focus on, or is it a mixed bag? What did you
Yeah,
find?
it's a mixed bag and mistakes get made through the entire life cycle of a big bet. We recently had a client that had a big bet going on, but they were making the mistake of treating it like an incremental project. So they were making big commitments up front. They were having this very deliberate and slow moving approach to it. They weren't really going to test the important things until the very end. So that's one type of failure is having a big bet, but not recognizing that it's different and treating it like an incremental. The other
Mhm.
mistakes that can be made is you think it's a big bet, but it's actually just an incremental project. That's a type of mistake. But I think the biggest mistake that gets made of all are where big bet is needed, but none is being taken.
Mm,
Call that error of omission.
right.
And I think every time you see a great company go to average or an average company go to irrelevant, well, that's where a big bet was needed
Mm,
and where it wasn't recognized. The company didn't get to the truth of the problems in their business, and they did not attack them with a new way of thinking relative to it. And so the mistakes get made through the entire life cycle. And I think that's part of the wicked problem of why these initiatives fail so much is you can't boil it down to like, okay, do this one or two things and you will be successful. It is an operating model that it takes.
mhm,
And that's really what big bet leadership is an operating model for the job of the senior leaders, the kind of the surrounding culture, leadership model, tactics that senior leadership teams need to take around a big bet environment.
it's a great point that you make. I mean, every CEO should be able to answer the question, what are the big bets that your company is taking now and going forward? And if they look at you dumbfounded, that's probably a bad
Yeah,
response.
yeah, it's okay to have the answer. It's like, well, right now there's none, right? Like,
Right.
just be deliberate about the
Mhm,
evaluation of your business. Are you purely in kind of an incremental and scaling phase? You've got all this room to take, or are there some fundamental problems in the business that have to be attacked, or your job is to not just harvest kind of this current horizon capability, but to create the early pipeline for the next horizon businesses, right? And so there's a couple of different
mhm.
scenarios, but at the end of the day, just have eyes wide open. Be deliberate about the decisions you're making. There's lots of discussion out there about, well, how much should we allocate from an enterprise basis relative to kind of incrementalism versus next horizon, and McKinsey
Mhm.
has kind of this 90-20-10 ratio, but that's a rule of thumb. Your
Yeah.
answer needs to be your answer, and it's okay to have a portfolio of zero as long as you are deliberate about it.
Mm. Yeah. Great point.
No, I don't think many companies should have a portfolio of zero, but
Right.
at
Right.
at at least be deliberate about your decision there.
Yeah. Yeah. Understood. John, I have to ask about intelligent automation. Of course, I live in that industry, but it would seem that most companies are making a big bet on automation and AI, some going faster than others. But do you generally find that that is a very common big bet for most companies, or do you see it varying by industry?
Yeah, so the title of the book is Big Bet Leadership. The subtitle is Your Transformation Playbook for Winning in the Hyperdigital Era. And so the preface of the book is about what's the hyperdigital era, John. And what
Huh.
we forecast is essentially if you think the past 25 years of digital transformation has been disruptive and has created change, the next 25 is going to make this current past era pale in comparison. And so
Hmm.
what I see is companies that with Gen AI, they're taking the quick, obvious early wins in applying it to the jobs and the tasks where it truly has an easy to understand superpower. So those tend to be in marketing, in customer service, and in software development, right? The next wave is going to be harder to get to, but that's really where companies need to get to. And so my forecast is that there are going to be companies who create an operating model that is 10 to 100x more productive than the equivalent operating model would be today. So I don't think many companies actually have the aspirational goals of going on a journey to fundamentally rethink their operating model, leveraging platforms like intelligent automation. But I'm telling you, there's enough of them out there that this is where the new
Hmm.
winners and the new losers of this next era are going to come from. And I think it's going to come faster than the past era came upon us in the early 2000s. And my fundamental belief is that you have to do it early for at least a couple of
Hmm.
reasons. One is you then have the luxury of time and resources to do it. But the other thing is like it takes an operating mentality to do this right. Like think of it as like an athletic skill. You have to
Hmm.
practice the athletic skill. You can't wake up and say, I'm going to be world class at this move. You have to develop into it. And so if you are a company that comes from a great operating background, but you're not systematic about how you innovate or systematic about how you create change or apply technology like this or always pushing forward, then you need to develop that capacity over time. So the current capabilities of Gen AI is a great way to build some confidence, get some wins
Hmm.
under the belt, but you have to couple that with some ambition to keep going and to do way more than just the easy, obvious use cases around Gen AI.
John, in the book, you talk about some of the leadership challenges that are hindering companies from driving digital transformation initiatives as their big bets. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so there's lots of mistakes that get made, but fundamentally, when I get asked to like, "Hey, John, come in and just give us your perspective on this transformation initiative or strategy or portfolio that we have," well, the first thing I'll do is I ask for kind of the documentation. Tell me about the project and everything. And the second thing is I go and interview, you know, 10 to 15 people, and I'll ask them two questions: What's the problem you're solving?
Mhm.
And what's the future state look like? And I will tell you, a third of those people won't even be able to answer the question. And the other two thirds that answer the question will have not just different answers, they will have wildly different answers
Mhm.
to what I think is just the absolute basis. What problem are we solving? And what's our hypothesis for what the future state looks like? So, in the book, this is the fundamental framework that we start the book with in the first section, which is big bet thinking. So,
Mhm.
big bet legends have three habits that other really good leaders don't have when it comes to transformation. The first of those habits is create clarity. So they create clarity. They do not suffer from vague notions of a transformation or improving the customer experience. They get to the very heart of a specific matter of the problem and the hypothesis to the future state. And that's where solutions start. Now, you need to take that framework and leverage it throughout the life cycle of this. But if you don't have that initial framing of a big bet vector, everything else, all the risk factors and the costs and the speed quickly ravel out of control without that fundamental understanding.
And clearly, strategic communication is essential. You talk about that in the book as well, about aligning the stakeholders around a digital transformation. What do you think are the best practices for achieving that?
Yeah, I'll
So-
talk about two best practices focused on kind of two different types of stakeholders or teams. So
Okay.
the first is like the team that is figuring out what to do, right? And I think the best practice is what, is Amazon's working backwards approach, which is about a set of memos and truth seeking discussions that start with the end in mind, start with the problem, and work backwards to, well, what are
Hmm.
the key hypotheses, that what are the things that would have to be true to enable that? So we reverse engineered that working backwards process into what we call thinking and outcomes and a set of memos to help do that. But it is the writing and debating and the truth seeking together, which is the best practice of getting to this big bet vector. The second audience is like your stakeholders that you need to bring along
Hmm.
on this journey. And it is, as you pointed out, essential. And so we talk about this as being the chief repeating officer, and that a big bet legend is a master at repeating the simple, concise messages that are needed. But you actually need to repeat helpful messages and not diluted or abstract or lacking clarity or conviction types of messages. So, using this big bet vector, what a good chief repeating officer does is they create what's called a destination postcard, right? So, this is a concept
Hmm.
that we borrowed from a really good book called Switch How to Change When Change is Hard by the Heath brothers. And what a
Hmm.
destination postcard does is it creates a simple but vivid picture of the problem you are solving, where we are going to, and the journey that we are on. Where are we currently on relative to this? Well, guess what? Because we've done the hard work of creating this big bet vector and debating these things, then creating these destination postcard communications is a pretty simple task. But a, a big bet leader needs to become that chief repeating officer again and again and do them in a
Hmm.
story format, right? A story is 22 times more memorable than simple facts or figures. And I truly think it is one of the hidden superpowers of so many fantastic change leaders is the ability to tell consistent, simple stories where
Hmm.
the audience, the listeners are on the hero's journey here, but we are also being transparent and honest about the changes that we are seeking to do. And I think both that authenticity and that clarity of like, hey, here's the change and why we have to do it, and being honest with the audience in appropriate ways, that actually really helps them make the adjustments that are necessary.
I'm so glad you brought up the destination postcard because I really did find that interesting. Something else I thought was really intriguing is this idea of high impact experimentation. Could you expand on that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there's three critical habits of big bet legends. I mentioned the first one, create clarity. The
Hmm.
second is maintain velocity. The third is probably the hardest to actually conceptualize. And the third critical habit is they accelerate risk and value, deferring out as many commitments and non-critical spend and items as possible. And so high impact experimentation is about recognizing, leveraging your big bet vector and recognizing, well, what are the truly critical things that have to be true to deliver this future capability that we are talking about? And what you're seeking is both those capabilities, the things that must be true, that are both truly high value and they are high risk. So if you were to create a test around that particular capability, it actually delivers a ton of value because it actually takes a big risk item off the table. And so high impact testing is about recognizing the 3 to 5 truly critical things that have to be true to deliver a future state, pulling those forward, designing an experiment to get better insights into like, do we understand this well? How would we deliver? Is it actually that critical? But the killer habit is that deferring as many other activities or items to do as possible. And it's just not the way that most teams kind of build solutions. Most teams build in a very, if you think about taking a journey up a mountain, they go from the base to the middle part of the mountain, from the middle part of the mountain to the peak. Well, what we're suggesting is we have to figure out how to flip the script and start with the peak first. That takes a very
Mm.
different mindset. And this is one of the traps that leaders fall in. At times, it feels like you're going slow, and at times, it feels like you're wasting money. But
Hmm.
and that mindset can be the exact thing that sinks a big bet is thinking you understand something when it's actually an assumption or a hypothesis and you actually don't have the clarity. So a good example of this is oftentimes like an adoption risk. It could be either a customer adoption risk or an employee adoption risk. And what we tend
Mhm.
to do is we tend to build out the entire platform until the very end. And then we get to see what either customer adoption or employee adoption is. But if you could
Mhm.
figure out how do we actually test out what that either customer acquisition costs or that adoption risk is up front before building the big capability here, well, you flip the script on how you're testing the critical aspects of your big bet out.
That makes me think about agile methodology, and I'm smiling because you and I grew up in the waterfall methodology era where you'd be 9 months, 12 months in on a project before you'd even start testing, and
Y-
then you realize, "Gosh, we
But
missed the boat," right?
but
Yeah.
most agile implementations get this wrong. And it's not because the agile methodology is wrong or that they're applying agile.
Mhm.
It's that they aren't putting the right inputs or constraints around what they're testing. So they're
Yeah.
starting off, they're applying agile, but they're still trekking up the mountain in a very incremental way. And I've worked with a lot of corporate innovation teams, and what they tend to do is not be environments of high accountability. And so one of the things
Mm.
we're always doing in big bet leadership is the second critical habit is maintain velocity. So you have to put constraints and primarily kind of time constraints on all of these activities to maintain that velocity. And that
Mm.
helps battle the other challenge of so many of these big bets, which is kind of analysis paralysis and just slowing it down so it kind of acts like every other corporate initiative. That is a absolute death nail for so many of these types of initiatives, because when they
Yeah.
start taking long, then you can't let them do what they should do, which is to be tested and to make adjustments to them. And so that's why those are the three critical habits. And while I oftentimes refer to the agile methodology as the methodology of no accountability, right? Like, hey, no
Mhm.
scope, no budget, no time frame, like we're agile, right? Like I've literally
Right.
experienced that so many times. But if you apply the constraints, then the agile methodology becomes critical relative to this journey. But what we
Yeah.
have now framed is true enterprise agility of understanding high ambition, high risk situations where we have to test them out. And that's how we are both successful at them and let them do what they should do, which is to be tested.
Mhm. Yeah. So, John, as I was preparing some questions for this interview, I did go to my Gen AI platform and I said, if you had to pull one principle from John Rossman's book titled Big Bet Leadership, what would that be? And the response was overcome analysis paralysis,
That's great.
so
I love it.
which you just said. So it
Y-
must be highly emphasized in the book.
all of these risks, if you overcorrect, they have a corollary, the flip side of the coin risk, right? And so on
Mhm.
one hand, I'm encouraging, like, you have to think a lot harder and more clear upfront about the problem you're solving and what your hypothesis is. But the counter risk to that is like you take too long doing it, right? And
Mhm.
so you have to put constraints in. So throughout the book, we're always talking about the activity to do and then the constraint to put on it to help avoid analysis paralysis.
Yeah. So, John, looking ahead, what emerging trends do you believe will shape the next phase of digital transformation and AI adoption as well in businesses?
I'll go back to the preface of the book. What's the hyper digital era? And I talk about three mega forces that I think are really going to shape this next period, which I've framed as the hyper digital era. And those three mega forces, one is technology. And this technology is doing and is going to continue to do what all technology history has done, which is it's going to become more powerful, it's going to become easier, and it's going to become cheaper by abstracting all the complexities away, right? And so
Mhm.
the hard things about applying this technology today will not be the hard things in 18 months. And you're already seeing those curves of speed, cost, accuracy, dramatic
Mhm.
improvement across all of these AI and Gen AI platforms. But the other two mega forces are just as critical. The other two mega forces are the aging of our workforce and
Mhm.
the difficulty in attracting and retaining skilled labor. Well, that's going to create a
Mhm.
force and a motivation to automate more, automate
Yeah.
more, automate more, right? And the third mega force is really a national mega force, which is the committed spend that we have to both entitlement spending and to our national deficit. And the only way we solve for that as a country is by innovating more, by outgrowing, by creating more productive.
Mhm.
And so I think those three mega forces, each one an independent big factor, but combined is going to create this environment of chaotic opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And there's going to be companies that either are early and figure out how to create their version, which takes advantage of these, or you're going to be late and typically you're going to be a loser on that. And so, my final piece of advice in the book is that senior leadership needs to be an active skeptic. And both of
Mm.
those words are super important. Active meaning you appropriate your time, resources to testing, to participating in figuring out your journey on this, but skeptic in that you test things out before you commit to them in a big way. And you can't be either an active optimist and just saying, making big commitments up front, or a passive skeptic. I'm just going to let others
Mhm.
figure that out. I'll do it when the time is right for me. You have to be an active skeptic. And that's what I fundamentally believe in is some companies are getting that and some companies are not getting that.
Mm. Love it. Well, John, as we wrap up, one thing I loved about your book is you had a really good quote at the beginning of each chapter. As you think about all those quotes, which one would you say is your favorite?
Well, it's my favorite because it reminds me of, I think, my own biggest personal failing. And it's the quote that starts the chapter of Think Big, Bet Small, which is about the high impact testing
Mhm.
that needs to be done. And it's from Michelangelo, who's a 15th century Renaissance man and artist. And his quote is this, which is the greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. And ultimately, I think that the winners will be those that figure out a way to have high ambition and a way to test these things out. And I see way too many companies, teams, and leaders settling for just incremental and marginal improvements, marginal advancements. And the problem is they're going to hit their mark.
Awesome. Well, John, it has been a real pleasure having you on for your third time on the podcast. And I truly think your book is a gem, and I recommend it highly to business leaders in small companies, mid-sized companies, large companies. I think there's a lot of really good advice for company leaders. Why not learn from you and Kevin and your experience and your wins and, as you said, your failures as well. So thanks
Well,
for being on. I really appreciate it. And I
well,
wish you the best.
Thank you. It is it's a beautiful physical book, but the audio book, we designed it to be a very good listen and read. And so it's a very good listen also, which is how I consume most of my material. And hence why I'm a big fan of your podcast and appreciate all that you bring to it.
Great. We'll put the link to your book information and the audio version as well. We'll put that in the show notes. So
Perfect.
thanks again, John.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of intelligent automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.